There is a particular kind of person you have almost certainly encountered, perhaps without ever finding the precise language to describe what you were dealing with. First, they seem extraordinary. They carry themselves with a confidence that borders on magnetic. They speak of their plans, their talents, their destiny, the certainty that makes you wonder, if only briefly, whether you have been thinking too small all along. People are drawn to them. Rooms reorganize themselves around their presence. And then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, something begins to shift. Their confidence reveals itself to be something closer to hunger. Their charm reveals itself to be a kind of currency, spent deliberately, withdrawn the moment it stops producing a return. And you, who once felt elevated simply by being near them, begin to feel something far less pleasant. That you exist, in their eyes, primarily as an audience, a resource, or an obstacle. You have just encountered one of the most powerful, most destructive, and most poorly understood forces in human nature. You have encountered the narcissist. To understand this figure properly, you must abandon the casual, watered-down version of the word that has saturated modern conversation, where anyone mildly self-absorbed or vain gets labeled with the term the narcissism that genuinely shapes human destinies, that topples companies, corrodes marriages, and occasionally reorders the fate of nations, is something far deeper, far more structural, and far more dangerous than simple vanity. It is, at its root, not an excess of self-love, as the casual use of the word implies, but precisely the opposite. A catastrophic deficiency of self, papered over by a desperate, lifelong performance of strength. This is the great irony sitting at the center of the narcissistic character, and it is the single most important thing you must grasp if you wish to understand, anticipate, and defend yourself against this type. The narcissist is not someone who loves himself too much. He is someone who, at the deepest level, does not experience a stable, continuous sense of self at all, and who has constructed, often beginning in early childhood, an elaborate external structure of admiration, attention, and control specifically to compensate for that absence. Consider, for a moment, the psychological foundation of an ordinary, healthy identity. A person with what we might call a secure sense of self has internalized, usually through consistent, attentive caregiving in childhood, a stable inner feeling of worth that does not require constant external validation to remain intact. Such a person can absorb criticism without collapsing. They can lose an argument, suffer a setback, or be ignored in a room, and emerge from the experience with their fundamental sense of identity essentially undisturbed. Their self, in other words, has a kind of internal architecture, load-bearing walls that do not depend on the opinions of others to remain standing. The narcissist possesses no such architecture. Beneath the confident exterior lies what might be described as a kind of psychological void, an internal emptiness, that the narcissist has spent an entire lifetime engineering elaborate strategies to avoid ever directly confronting. This void typically has its origins in a childhood marked by a particular and instructive pattern, not necessarily neglect in the obvious sense, but rather a relationship with caregivers built on conditional approval, where love and attention were offered not consistently, simply because the child existed, but specifically in response to achievement, performance, image, or the satisfaction of a parent's own unfulfilled ambitions. In such an environment, the child learns an early and devastating lesson, that their authentic, unembellished self is insufficient. What earns love, attention, and safety is not who they are, but how impressively they perform. So, rather than developing a secure internal sense of identity, the child instead develops a kind of false self, a curated, idealized persona constructed specifically to earn the approval that was never offered unconditionally. This false self becomes over years and decades, increasingly elaborate, increasingly convincing, and increasingly detached from whatever fragile, uncertain self might exist underneath it. By adulthood, this false self has become so deeply practiced, so seamlessly performed, that the narcissist himself often loses meaningful access to the difference between the performance and any authentic interior experience. He comes to believe, with what appears to be total sincerity, in his own grandiosity, his own exceptional destiny, his own immunity to the ordinary rules and limitations that govern everyone else. This is not, as is commonly misunderstood, simple arrogance. It is a survival structure, built brick by brick across an entire childhood, now operating largely outside the narcissist's own conscious awareness. This explains a pattern that confuses nearly everyone who encounters a narcissist for the first time: the sheer scale of their need for admiration. An ordinary person enjoys praise, certainly, but does not require it merely to feel like a coherent, continuous self from one day to the next. The narcissist, by contrast, depends on a continuous, ongoing supply of external validation, in precisely the way an addict depends on a substance, because that validation is functioning, psychologically, as a direct substitute for the stable internal identity he was never permitted to develop. Admiration is not, for the narcissist, a pleasant bonus. It is fuel, without which the entire elaborate structure of the false self begins to destabilize. This single insight unlocks nearly every behavior pattern you will observe in narcissistic individuals, and it is worth walking through these patterns carefully, because each one will eventually become a tool you can use to identify this character type long before they have done any serious damage to your life, your career, or your sense of self. Consider first the narcissist relationship to criticism. To an ordinary person, criticism, however unpleasant, represents information, a signal that can be weighed, considered, and either accepted or rejected based on its merit. To the narcissist, criticism represents something far more catastrophic, a direct assault on the only structure holding his fragile sense of identity together. This is why you will observe, again and again, a wildly disproportionate reaction to even mild critique. A narcissist, confronted with reasonable, measured feedback, will often respond not with curiosity or reflection, but with explosive defensiveness, icy withdrawal, or a sudden, vicious counterattack designed to destroy the credibility of whoever dared to offer the criticism in the first place. This reaction has nothing to do with the actual content of what was said. It is a structural reflex, the psychological equivalent of an immune system responding to a perceived existential threat. Consider, second, the narcissist's extraordinary skill at securing initial admiration, often within minutes of meeting someone new. This is not accidental, nor is it simply a byproduct of genuine charisma, though genuine charisma is frequently present as well. The narcissist has, across an entire lifetime, developed an acute, almost predatory sensitivity to what other people want to hear, what flatters their own self-image, what makes them feel special, intelligent, or understood. This sensitivity is then deployed with remarkable precision in the earliest stages of any relationship, professional or personal, creating an intoxicating sense of being truly seen, truly valued, truly understood by this magnetic new presence in your life. This is precisely why so many of the narcissist victims, when describing the early stages of the relationship, use language bordering on the romantic, even in purely professional contexts. They describe feeling chosen, special, elevated. This feeling is genuine, in the sense that it is a real emotional experience. But it is manufactured, in the sense that it has been deliberately engineered, consciously or not, to secure your loyalty, your investment, and eventually, your usefulness as a source of ongoing admiration. It is worth pausing here to address an important and uncomfortable nuance. Not every narcissist consciously, deliberately manipulates in the way a cold-blooded strategist might calculate a chess move. Many operate from something closer to instinct, a deeply practiced pattern of behavior that feels, to them, like simple, authentic interaction, rather than calculated manipulation. This does not make the pattern any less dangerous to those caught within it. If anything, it makes it more dangerous, because it means the narcissist himself often genuinely believes his own performance, lending it a conviction and consistency that a more calculated deceiver could never sustain. Consider, third, what happens once the early phase of idealization inevitably begins to fade, as it always eventually does. No human being, however skillfully they manage their image, can sustain perfect, uninterrupted admiration indefinitely. At some point, you will fail to provide sufficient validation. You will express a need of your own. You will succeed at something in a way that even briefly draws attention away from the narcissist. You will, simply by existing as a separate person with your own interior life, fail to function purely as the adoring mirror the narcissist requires. When this happens, you will witness one of the most disorienting experiences in all of human relationships: a sudden, often severe devaluation. The same person who once seemed to find you fascinating, brilliant, and indispensable will, often within a remarkably short period of time, begin treating you with coldness, irritation, or outright contempt. This shift can feel bewildering precisely because nothing fundamental about you has changed. What has changed is your usefulness within the narcissist's psychological economy. You have stopped supplying sufficient admiration, or worse, you have begun to threaten the narcissist's grandiose self-image simply by asserting your own needs, perspectives, or successes. This pattern, idealization followed by devaluation, repeats with such consistency across narcissistic relationships, whether romantic, professional, or familial, that it deserves to be understood as a structural law rather than an occasional unfortunate occurrence. Once you recognize this rhythm, you will find it considerably easier to identify a narcissist early, often during the very idealization phase that feels, to most people, like the most pleasant and flattering part of the entire relationship. There is a further dimension to the narcissistic character that deserves particular attention, because it explains some of the most baffling and infuriating behavior these individuals produce: their relationship to responsibility and blame. Because the narcissist's entire psychological structure depends on maintaining an image of exceptional competence, intelligence, and destiny, the acknowledgement of genuine fault represents an almost unbearable threat. As a result, you will observe, with remarkable consistency, an extraordinary talent for redirecting blame onto others, reframing failures as the result of someone else's incompetence, betrayal, or bad luck, regardless of the narcissist's own clear contribution to the outcome. This is rarely experienced internally as conscious dishonesty. Rather, the narcissist has typically developed, across years of practice, a genuinely held belief in his own innocence within any given conflict, belief sustained through selective memory, retroactive reframing, and an almost artistic talent for constructing a version of events in which he remains, somehow, always the wronged party. Confronting a narcissist with objective evidence of their own responsibility rarely produces the acknowledgement a reasonable person might expect. More often, it produces escalating defensiveness, a pivot toward counter-accusation, or a sudden, theatrical display of wounded innocence designed to shift the emotional burden of the conflict back onto you. Understanding this dynamic protects you from one of the most exhausting and ultimately futile mistakes people make when dealing with narcissists: the attempt to win through reasoned argument, hoping that sufficient evidence, patience, or emotional appeal will eventually produce honest self-reflection. This almost never works, because the narcissist's resistance to acknowledging fault is not a failure of reasoning. It is a structural necessity for psychological survival. You are not arguing against a position. You are pressing directly against the foundation of an entire constructed identity. And identities under direct assault do not yield to logic. They defend themselves by whatever means prove necessary. History offers an abundance of case studies illustrating these patterns at their most consequential scale, and it is worth examining a few of them closely, because the narcissistic pattern, once you learn to recognize it, becomes visible again and again across very different eras, cultures, and arenas of power. Consider the trajectory common to a particular kind of historical leader, a figure who rises to power not merely through competence, though competence is frequently present in the early stages, but through an extraordinary, almost hypnotic capacity to convince an entire population of his own exceptional destiny. Such figures often begin their ascent during periods of genuine national crisis or humiliation, conditions under which a population, hungry for restored pride and decisive leadership, becomes unusually receptive to a leader who projects absolute, unshakable confidence, regardless of whether that confidence is actually warranted by underlying circumstances. In the early phases of such a rise, the leader's grandiosity often appears, to outside observers, indistinguishable from genuine visionary conviction. He speaks of destiny, of historical inevitability, of a future so glorious it justifies whatever sacrifices the present moment demands. Followers experience, often quite genuinely, the same intoxicating sense of being chosen, elevated, and included in something larger than themselves that individual victims of narcissistic relationships describe in more intimate contexts. The mechanism is identical, merely operating at the scale of an entire nation, rather than a single relationship. What follows, with remarkable historical consistency, is the devaluation phase, arriving now not for an individual partner, but for entire populations, entire allied nations, entire constituencies, who once supplied the leader with adoration. As the inevitable failures, contradictions, and costs of grandiose ambition accumulate, the leader's psychological structure cannot tolerate acknowledgement of fault. Blame is redirected, with increasing intensity, toward internal enemies, external conspirators, treacherous subordinates, anyone except the architect of the grandiose vision himself. Those who once supplied unconditional admiration, the moment they express doubt, criticism, or simple human limitation, frequently find themselves recast, with startling speed, as enemies of the very cause they once helped build. This historical pattern repeats across business empires as readily as it repeats across political movements. Consider the particular trajectory of corporate leaders whose early genuine talent and vision eventually curdle into something far more dangerous. An inability to tolerate any internal voice suggesting limitation, caution, or correction. Such leaders often surround themselves, deliberately or through unconscious selection, with subordinates willing to supply continuous affirmation rather than honest counsel. Precisely because honest counsel, however necessary for the health of the enterprise, registers, at the psychological level, as an intolerable threat to the leader's grandiose self-image. The result, with depressing regularity, is a slow, often invisible drift toward catastrophic decision-making, masked for years by genuine, early success and an increasingly elaborate culture of internal flattery, until the underlying structural weakness finally produces a collapse that, in retrospect, every honest observer can see was building for years. What then can be done? How does one navigate a world that inevitably contains narcissistic individuals in workplaces, families, friendships, and romantic relationships, without either becoming their next casualty or descending into a paranoid suspicion of everyone who happens to display ordinary, healthy confidence? The first and most essential skill is early recognition. ideally during the idealization phase itself, before significant emotional or professional investment has occurred. Pay particular attention to the speed and intensity of admiration offered by someone you have only just met. Genuine respect and affection typically build gradually through accumulated experience and demonstrated trustworthiness. A narcissist, by contrast, frequently offers intense admiration almost immediately, flattering sense of special connection that arrives suspiciously fast before there has been any meaningful opportunity to actually earn it. This is not by itself definitive proof of narcissism. It warrants careful, patient observation rather than immediate, grateful reciprocation. Second essential skill is observing how a person discusses their past conflicts, failures, and relationships, particularly ones that ended badly. A healthy individual recounting a difficult relationship or professional failure will typically demonstrate some degree of nuance, acknowledging their own contribution to the outcome, alongside whatever legitimate grievances they hold against others. A narcissist's account of past conflict, by contrast, frequently reveals a suspiciously consistent pattern. He is, across every story, the wronged party, the misunderstood genius, the victim of others' incompetence, jealousy, or betrayal. A person whose entire personal history consists exclusively of being wronged by an unbroken series of unreasonable people deserves careful, skeptical attention. The third essential skill, perhaps the most difficult to practice, is resisting the particular emotional intoxication the narcissist specializes in producing. Their early attention can feel genuinely transformative, as though you have finally been truly seen and appreciated after years of feeling overlooked. This feeling, however real it seems in the moment, should function as a warning signal rather than a reassurance. The intensity of the high during idealization correlates directly with the severity of the evaluation that will eventually follow. Approach unusually intense, unusually rapid admiration with the same caution you might apply to any offer that seems too good to be true, because in a structural sense, it almost always is. Once you find yourself already entangled with a narcissist, whether professionally or personally, a different set of strategies becomes necessary. Direct confrontation, particularly any attempt to make the narcissist consciously acknowledge the pattern of their own behavior, will almost always fail, and will frequently provoke an escalation rather than the reflection you might reasonably hope for. A more productive strategy involves quietly, gradually reducing your own emotional and practical dependence on the relationship, withdrawing the specific behaviors, the visible admiration, the eager validation that the narcissist's psychological structure depends upon, while simultaneously building independent sources of security, validation, and support that do not run through the narcissist at all. This withdrawal must be conducted carefully, because a narcissist who senses his primary source of admiration beginning to slip away will frequently respond with an intensified, often quite convincing, return to the original idealization behavior, a phenomenon sometimes informally described as hoovering, in which charm, attention, and apparent self-reflection return with startling sincerity, specifically in proportion to how seriously the narcissist senses he is losing his audience. Recognizing this pattern for what it is, a structural response to perceived loss of supply, rather than genuine change, protects you from the common and costly mistake of repeatedly re-engaging with a dynamic that has already revealed its underlying nature. There is, finally, a broader and more philosophical lesson embedded within this entire study of the narcissistic character, one that extends well beyond simple self-protection. The narcissist represents, in an exaggerated and often destructive form, a tendency that exists to some degree within every human psychology, the temptation to construct an identity around external validation rather than internal substance, to seek security in the admiration of others rather than in the quieter, more difficult work of building genuine competence, genuine self-knowledge, and genuine resilience against criticism and failure. Studying the narcissist closely, then, serves two simultaneous purposes. It equips you to recognize and protect yourself against this particular character type. When you encounter it in others, near certainty across any sufficiently long professional or personal life. It also offers a kind of inverted mirror, an opportunity to examine your own relationship to admiration, criticism, and identity, to ask honestly whether your own sense of self rests on a foundation substantial enough to withstand failure, criticism, and the ordinary disappointments of a life lived among other imperfect human beings, or whether it depends, even slightly, on a continuous supply of external validation that no stable identity should ever require. A narcissist, for all the damage he causes, for all the wreckage he leaves behind in relationships, careers, and occasionally entire nations, is ultimately a tragic figure as much as a dangerous one. A person trapped for life within a performance he can never fully escape, dependent forever on an audience he can never permit to look away, terrified beneath every grandiose claim and every flash of magnetic charm, the emptiness that performance was constructed from childhood onward, specifically to conceal. To understand this is not to excuse the damage narcissists inflict, nor to soften your defenses against them. It is, rather, to understand your adversary with the clarity that any serious student of human bio nature must eventually develop, not through naive sympathy, and not through simple fear, but through the unsentimental, clear-eyed recognition of exactly what you are dealing with and exactly what it will cost you if you mistake a desperate performance of strength for the genuine article. Master this recognition, and you gain something far more valuable than mere protection from a single dangerous character type. You gain a deeper, more accurate map of human motivation itself, one that will serve you in every arena where ambition, insecurity, and the desperate human hunger for significance continue to shape the decisions of those around you, as they always have and as they always will.